So in the morning. Let's get started. So Oliver, to begin the conversation, could you first give a little bit about what HighSpot does, and really then talk about your journey of getting started and going what I would consider to be all in with generative AI.
Sure. So we started HighSpot about 12 years ago, and we didn't know at the time that we were in the sales enablement space, but we are in the sales enablement space. We know that now. And basically, our job is to help sellers and generally customer-facing teams have the most effective engagement possible with customers. And so a kind of a classic enablement problem, just for those of you who aren't as familiar with it, is one of our customers is Adobe. They have 27,000 users on HighSpot. They're scattered across 20 countries. They speak 18 different languages. Let's say they launch a new product. And now they have to get 27,000 or some interesting subset of 27,000 people to do a new thing. And they need to do it systematically and effectively in order to drive business. And that's the enablement problem right there.
Great. And that's very easily articulated. So, and obviously, frontline sales is a fairly obvious place to think about generative AI at the high level. But when you peel the onion and try to figure out where to actually do it, what does your journey look like as you thought about your customers' needs, and then how could you take this? And also talk about when you started this, right? So was this before ChatGPT came out, or was it after that, or how did your journey begin?
Yeah. So we've been doing flavors of machine learning for a long, long time.
Of course.
The classic problem that we started with, probably that we spent the most effort on, was search. And search is kind of a classic natural language processing, ML-ish sort of problem. And we put quite a lot of energy in search, and it is one of the absolutely core capabilities of HighSpot. One of the main reasons you buy a HighSpot is that your current content solution is a nightmare. In most large organizations, they have tons of servers all over the place. Nobody can find anything. It's a big, giant mess. And so you bring HighSpot in, you bring all that content into one place, you organize it in the right way, and then you search it, as among other things. So we've been doing that forever, basically as soon as the company started. We then also tried other aspects of ML, and some of them were successful and some of them weren't. So, for example, one of our early lessons was we got really excited about the idea of building a tuned feed for users by reading the news and other things that were going on, and then basically using a rather, at the time, quite sophisticated ML model. And it worked really well, and it was great, and nobody cared. It was a total failure. And it's actually the only major feature we ever took out of the product in the entire history of the company because it was such a fail. And we learned a lot of things. We did some really lovely work, and we built some really nice infrastructure, and we were super thoughtful about tuning the models, and we had quite a sophisticated machine learning expert that we brought into the company. And yet it was a total fail. And that taught us some really important lessons. And specifically, the number one thing it taught me anyway was when you're looking at a powerful technology, start from the compelling customer need that you're solving, and think not just about what is it that they need, but when do they need it? Because one of the biggest challenges that we've encountered anyway is that you can sort of put this banquet of delights at people's feet, but they won't eat it unless there's a moment when they have some urge to do it, what I call the moment of action. And so a good example in our world is coaching. So one of the biggest problems in sales is that people don't get coached effectively. And so we're building all this technology to help managers coach their reps. But the biggest problem with coaching is that people don't have the time. It's one of those, important but not urgent things, like working out, right? It's hard. You should work out. It would make you better. It would make you healthier. But it's sometimes hard to have that moment of action where you actually get your butt off the sofa and you go and actually to the gym and work out. Similarly, there's a lot of things like that in the world where there's things you kind of know you should do. And even if the friction were dropped, you have to catch people at the moment when they're actually going to do it. And so that's something I've come to really focus on. And so whenever you think about like an AI solution, I always try to think about what's the moment of action, what's the moment when the person's gonna do something anyway, and you can get them at that moment, and not like create something that you hope they'll then go consume.
That's a very interesting observation. And so go back and say, so you built a news feed or a curated content stream to help your sales reps get smarter. And
Yep.
the thought was, hey, they're focused on selling this, so they'll want to get smarter all the time. But
Uh,
in fact, they're busy folk,
yeah,
right? And they're
absolutely.
probably, as we've always said, they're kind of coin operated. So
Yep.
if consuming that or doing that is not helping them, put some coins on the table or in their bank, they're just not going to spend time on it. Is your point?
And the thing you have to really internalize as a software person is that the mindset of a seller is very different than at least my mindset. I'm a perpetual student. I read all the time. I like to like wrestle with interesting hard new things just because I think that's fun. The median sales, of course, the salespeople, there's 25 million salespeople, so obviously any generalization isn't quite right. But the median salesperson is not like that. The median salesperson is very, very goal oriented. And they are constantly inundated with stuff that they're supposed to do that doesn't work. Like
Yeah.
every day, their company's like, you should do this, you should do that. Here's a resource. Da, da, da. And what they've learned to do, all the good ones have learned to tune all that out and be incredibly practical. And the way I kind of describe it is, a salesperson's natural tendency is, here is a thing. Okay, I'm going to say, I need to crack this object. I'm going to pick this up. I'm going to hit the object with this thing. And if it cracks, then I'll keep hitting more things with it. If it doesn't crack, I'll throw it away and look for a better tool. And so when you're building stuff for them, you have to build things that the person that you're building it for is actually going to find compelling, not what you think is cool. And I've really tried to ruthlessly strip my own persona out of the picture and focus as hard as I can on that person and just mainline their world and build things and then test with them rather than just use my own intuition.
So I think this is not specific to sales, right? A maniacal focus on customer need is the way to build a great product, right? And so you're saying it's easy to get distracted or enamored with the possibilities of a brand new technology like Gen AI, but if you lose sight, as you said, of what their need is or their moment of need, then it doesn't really matter. Yeah.
Exactly. And I love software and I love playing with software and mastering software. Most people don't.
Yeah.
Most people are trying to get their job done. And so if you build software for people who love software, you're going to have a very, very narrow audience. Now, maybe if you're targeting devs, maybe you can get away with something like that. I'm a little skeptical, but maybe. But if you're targeting people who are not software people, then that's just going to fail.
All right. So I'm going to ask you maybe 3 or 4 more questions, but I'm going to encourage the audience to start putting some things into the chat window. So because we want this to be interactive and not just Will interviewing Oliver. This is Ask Oliver Anything, and he will come up with a good answer, I'm pretty sure. Let me come back then so given the need to be maniacally focused on customer need and this giant world of generative AI, which opens up so many possibilities, as I recall from our conversations, you ended up with on the order of 8 specific use cases at the moment that you've dove into and implemented and rolled out some set of those. But tell us about how did you pick so you talked about the one that failed. How did you pick the first one that succeeded? And what was the journey of figuring out really what you needed to do and then how to put that in front of customers and then to deploy it at scale?
Yeah, so it's a bit of an art. And so the way I would say it is that you need to think about what are the really hard problems that people are frustrated by. And so, as an example, I'll give you 2. One that's sort of more of an administrative one that's quite simple to do, and one that's much harder to do. So, one problem, well, I'll start with the simple one. So one of the things we do is we manage content. And one of the things you can do with content in our system is you can set up a lot of metadata. You can organize it into different lists and anyway, and you can give descriptions for it. And it turns out that doing all that stuff is really boring. And we have people, we have customers who have 100,000 items in HighSpot. And writing a description for 100,000 items is not a joyful experience. And it turns out that AI, LLMs, are really, really, really good at taking a big thing and summarizing it in a succinct summary. Like, they're just awesome at that. And so, a very obvious thing was, okay, great, build a feature that lets you just push a button and have it automatically do that. Then you can generalize that to say, okay, now we want to be able to go into our reporting system, do a bulk select, and apply the generate description verb to 1,000 items at once. Then you could imagine a world where the system basically automatically generates all the descriptions. Maybe it asks you if that's okay. Maybe it just does it automatically. And so you can take a specific friction point, and then you can build a specific solution for the friction point, but then you can generalize that to scale it out more and more to solve that problem more broadly. So that's a pretty easy one. And it's
But to be clear, you pick the production side, not the consumption side, as your first point of attack.
That was one of our first points of attack.
Okay.
And then now I'll do one on the consumption side.
Okay.
So sellers don't love searching for things and then browsing through documents to try to get the answer to a question. That's just a pure waste of their time. What they want is the answer to the question immediately. And they often resort to tribal knowledge. Sometimes Slack is faster than search. And especially in companies traditionally where the content's scattered all over the place, the best search capability is often to use, Slack or Teams or whatever, some IM solution, rather than actually trying to find the darn thing yourself. And so we built, of course, search for a long, long time. But then the next step on that is the kind of thing that, obviously Google and Bing and Perplexity and other people are doing as well, which is you type the question and the system answers the question for you. And so that's what we call that instant answers. And so we shipped that. Now, what's interesting is that there's levels of that, because sometimes you can just answer with a snappy little soundbite and you're done. However, depending on your audience, like let's say you're supporting the services team. The services team frequently needs more than just the snappy soundbite in order to, because they're actually hands-on keyboard helping customers in complicated situations with, one of our customers is Amazon Web Services. And so if you're in services in Amazon Web Services and somebody asks you a question about how to, optimally deploy a global scale distributed database, you're not going to give them a snappy little paragraph soundbite. They need a lot of data. And so what you want is you want to give them the soundbite, but then you also want to give them the references where they can then go learn more. And you don't want to be wrong. Because if the Amazon Web Services person steers their customer down some, wretched path and gets their configuration wrong, that is not going to go well for their customer or the AWS person. And so, there's layers, and you have to think about the scenarios in that layered way, because it's not, instant answers isn't one scenario. It's like a whole bunch of scenarios, and some of them are easier to do well on, and some of them are more okay to be a little wrong about. And some of them are really, really not okay to be wrong about. And so it's an interesting challenge how you build that layered system.
If we could go to that rabbit hole for a moment. So obviously hallucinating LLMs is a well understood problem and well overly experienced problem. On the other hand, it is entirely possible to make sure your LLM is never wrong and grounded in truth.
Yep.
So talk a little bit about how far did you go to ensure truth in all your answers, right? And where are you willing to architecturally allow being a little bit wrong, and how do you measure that little bit wrong, and then how do you also strive for being more correct and less wrong over time?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and it is absolutely not something that we're done with at all. I mean, this is a very, very, very active area of focus for us. So I'm going to give you some what we've learned so far on this journey, but it's absolutely a journey. And it's right now, it is one of the hardest things about getting this thing right. So let's talk about a few things. So one thing you do is, of course, you word your prompt and set your properties to the LLM in such a way to make it quite conservative. So that's one thing. A second thing you do is you cite your references. And it turns out that actually asking it to cite its references by itself makes it more accurate and careful, interestingly.
How do you describe that bucket to your customers?
You now get magical insights. And here are
Magical insights. Okay, I love your branding of your buckets.
Yeah, and it's been very interesting because I've had this conversation now with, I don't know, maybe 100 exec, above the line sales leaders in sales, marketing, and enablement, and it's really consistently resonated with them. And what I always do in the conversation, and I encourage you when you're talking to customers to ask questions where the answer is I don't know. So I say, tell me a top, like I was just talking to the head of enablement at a trillion-dollar technology company, which I won't name at the moment, and they're one of our customers. And I said, so what's one of the big initiatives you're driving right now? And they gave me their answer. And I said, and then I said, okay, here's what I'm guessing you probably did. And I listed all the things that they do. And they're like, yep, that's all the things I did. And I said, great. Is anybody doing that in the field? Like, what percentage of your sellers are actually doing that? And of course, their answer is,
they have no clue.
I don't know, and I said, great, do you want to know? And they're like, of course I want to know. And then I said, great, in another month, you'll know. And so, that is a way to make it come alive to people rather than, I'm building you this, I'm building that, I'm building this, I'm building that, is if you can first get them engaged around something they care about.
Yeah. Great. So those are now 4 buckets. So any other ones you want to put forward?
Those are the ones that I think about the most. And so then, okay, so you want to think about what are people struggling with? That's a key thing. What have people, and this one's harder, what have people given up on even being able to do? So our whole company, when we started it, everyone we talked to said, nah, I don't really think that's a thing. And basically everyone had given up on the possibility that finding content in a reasonable way inside of a company was actually possible. And so
I worked on that problem with Windows some 15 years ago, and it was identified as a big enterprise problem way back then, and it still is.
Yeah, and it was interesting because we said, well, we think we're gonna solve the problem, and everybody just sort of shrugged and said, it's not gonna happen. So you can't only look at things they articulate a desire for. You also look for things that they just sort of glumly accept is their lot in life. And that's another good clue that there's a chance to go into a space that other people aren't thinking about. See, the problem with the things that everybody says they want is lots of people are probably thinking about it. Whereas, it turned out there was a multi-billion-dollar space that nobody even knew existed. And we sort of, with one or two other competitors basically invented that there was a software solution for it. So look for both. Look for the things where people are complaining, and look for the people where they sort of roll their eyes and sigh.
But the risk of the second bucket, which, and this is where the art form of product development comes in, is your very first example you gave, which is you invented something you thought was a latent need, but it actually wasn't a latent need.
It's risky.
So apply all lessons learned from your first story of failure to your now suggesting of looking for latent unknown needs, or as you said, glum acceptance of reality, and so, but be careful as you do that to make sure that it will turn into an actual need.
Find ways to test whether that glum acceptance can be turned into active engagement, and just know that it's riskier. It's riskier because you might be wrong, or it might not, the need might not be as compelling as you think, but it's also safer in that those are generally not what I call Stanford dorm room problems. Like if you have like frantic numbers of little startups starting all the time in a space, that space is going to be hard because lots of smart people are going to be pounding away on it, and like it's messy and complicated and there's all this competition. When we started HighSpot, there wasn't a hell of a lot of competition in our space. And the companies that were in our space were sort of terrible, and they're all dead now. And so we were able to have a good long run of building the company before the competition really heated up. And so it's risky and it's safer in funny different ways.
Great. I'm going to turn now to a really good question asked by our group here, which is, and I'll just read it out loud for everybody. One great challenge with AI is how to monetize a tool or feature like what you're just describing. In many cases, the ROI of an AI feature has many levels of indirections that make it very difficult to measure. For example, you can use AI to improve your product, looking forward to improve your NPS or CSAT. But eventually you get more customers, but the cost might be much more than the revenue it generates. And you and I, when we talked before about, and the example you give on the magical insights, you're processing a ton of stuff there. That's very expensive. So what can you share with us about how you have moved from developing this clear need or latent need and put that into a monetization model that you can feel confident that's not going to kill the golden goose of the margin of your primary product, before you add this magical AI capability?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I'll answer it for HighSpot first, which is going to be maybe a slightly different answer than it would be for a startup. So let me just give our answer first, and then let's talk about it from a startup point of view. So we already had a pretty well-established monetization model, and we had quite a large number of customers. I mean, our run rate is not quite at, but heading for 200 million. We have about 1 million users. And so we had some, a little bit of oomph that could absorb some cost, and I know that in a startup you're in a different situation. So first, let me answer it from that perspective, and then let me talk about it from a startup perspective. So from our perspective, the key thing is we've got to model two things. We've got to model the incremental revenue we think we might be able to get by adding an AI capability. We also need to think about the counterfactual, which is what if we don't build it? Does it put any of our existing revenue at risk? So we have to think about it both upside and downside from a value point of view to revenue.
Is that a competitive point you're making in the second one?
It's a competitive point. Okay. And obviously the second one's harder to model, so it's less, it's more butter knife than scalpel when it comes to the downside, but it's at least important to think about. And then on the flip side, we got to model the cost. Now, modeling cost is tricky with AI, and we've gotten, because obviously the infrastructure is changing quite a bit. And sometimes you get it wrong. So let me give you an example where we got it really wrong. So when we were entering the coaching space, last year we released our coaching product, and it has this meeting intelligence component where we slurp in massive amounts of video and process the video and transcribe it and so on. And at the time, transcription was ferociously expensive, like brutal. And so all the products in that market charged a really high price in order to be able to absorb the COGS. And so we thought, if we go put a ton of IQ on the transcription problem, and if we figure out a really cheap way to transcribe, we'll have this unbeatable advantage because our COGS will be tiny compared to our competitors. We can charge a radically different price and still have good margins. And then, so we built it. We actually built.
Back up a minute. I just want to make sure you hit. How is it that your COGS are materially less than your competitors? Say that again.
We actually invested in building a much more efficient transcription solution.
So you went and took something that other people are using off the shelf API calls to Whisper or whatever, and you said, "Hey, we're going to go."
Whisper yet.
Okay. But
It was like Google had transcription and other people
got
had transcription. It was very expensive,
it. Okay.
and our competitors were using those technologies, and so their COGS were very high,
Got
and
it.
therefore their price was to some degree justified, and their price was crazy. I mean, like super high. And so we thought, well, our secret weapon will be that our price will be way, way low. Our COGS will be way lower, so we can charge a much lower price and still have great margins. So we went off and did that, and we had really made great progress, and we were really pleased with ourselves. And then Whisper came out, and the price basically went to zero. And so all that investment was completely wasted. And so when you make infrastructure investments in the AI space, you just be really sure that that's what you want to do, and be ready to just get wiped out.
I'm sure that you proudly told both yourselves and your investors, look at the moat that we have built with low cost transcription.
Yeah, we
And
were
we can
very,
do
very
this.
pleased with ourselves. The board was very pleased with us. Everybody was very pleased, and then it all just
And then
disappeared
boom,
in
gone.
a
Yeah.
heartbeat. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so it's a good lesson about, it didn't tell us don't invest in infrastructure, but it did tell us it's very risky to invest in infrastructure, and you have to be prepared to have it just disappear or change dramatically when, OpenAI releases a thing, or, whatever, somebody just releases a thing and it can blow you away. Another good example where infrastructure decisions are very hard is, so right now there's a lot of focus on hierarchical navigable small worlds, or HNSW, which is basically, for those, I mean, some of you probably know all about it, but for those of you who don't, it's basically a way to have a database of vectors and be able to efficiently ask a question, find me all the vectors that are near this vector in n space, essentially. And so essentially what you use it for is, let's say you're dividing up your content into chunks, and you have, might have 50 million or 100 million chunks. And each chunk is a little piece of content. And you want to say, here's a question somebody asked, find all the chunks of content that are about similar topics to the question. That's what HNSW does, basically. And right now, it's really, really, really hard to know what horse to bet on. There's a bunch of different technologies you can bet on. They all are really different in implementation. Like, Solar and Elasticsearch have one that's based on Lucene and inverted indices. And then you've got, Postgres, like throw in an HNSW thing. And then you've got like Pinecone, which is like a company that's got an opaque system that's like kind of the leading vendor. Anyway, and so it's really unclear which one is the right horse to bet on. And so what you have to do in that situation, you can't just sit around in analysis paralysis, and you can't be confident that you can make the right bet. And so the way we're approaching it is use a provider model, try to take as light a dependency as possible on the minutia details of any particular implementation, but get going. Don't sit around and wait. Get going on a plausible choice and put in a provider model, so if you're wrong, you can swap it out. And so you got to learn how to surf these infrastructure decisions. That's always been true in tech, of course. This isn't unique to this space, but it's moving faster in this world than it does in most other parts of technology at the moment.
That's a super important insight. And we actually recently, for our RAG architecture, added LLM agility to it so that we could literally switch between top level LLMs and see performance differences, and both in terms of recall and reasoning, and also then look at it from a price perspective.
Yeah, and there's another factor which comes up in our world a lot, which may or may not matter in the world that other people are in. But in our world, there are people who are absolutely adamant about which LLM you use. So for example, it turns out weirdly that Amazon Web Services does not want us to use Microsoft's ChatGPT interface. They want us to use Amazon's ML. And so we have to be able to swap in Claude instead of using ChatGPT. So sometimes your customers will determine which ones you can use. And it depends on what space you're in, whether that comes up or not. But especially if you're going after enterprises, some enterprises are extremely religious about stuff like this. And if you don't...
And that's true of LLMs, but it also maybe true of vector databases and all the other major components you're using, either for privacy or security reasons or any other strategic considerations.
And another one that comes up is if you aspire to target Europe as an audience, European companies may insist on data localization. So we have a customer. So one of our customers is Siemens. And in our contract, it says no Siemens data of any sort will ever set foot on US soil.
Yeah.
And so you have to be, so whatever you pick, if you want to go after customers like that, you have to make sure that you're able to control where the locality is of the data.
You're saying Siemens is fine if you want to host it in China, not in the US?
They are less concerned, weirdly, about China than they are about the U.S., but we don't put their data in China either.
Good.
The thing about the U.S. is the U.S. actually has a regulation which says they are allowed to seize data from a vendor that's on U.S. soil, and the vendor is not allowed to notify the company that it has been seized. Now, the likelihood that somebody's going to do that for your sales and marketing data is like zero, basically, but they don't care. They're not willing to run any risk like that.
So let me come to another audience question here. This comes back to your the cost discussion and the example you gave of dealing with a huge stream of information and the question around sampling. So when you looked at that, do you consider that you have to consume all of it? And when you're trying to create the magical insights, or can you potentially sample it as a way to deal with costs? And we actually have specifically one of our portfolio companies that has call centers, and they're trying to measure sentiment as well as actual content that's going on in the call center, and just the cost of doing that, and even the time to consume it with X tens of thousands of calls per day. It's a daunting task. So how do you think about sampling in that world of magical insights?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and it obviously depends very much on the insight in question. So sometimes what you're looking for is directional insight into a large aggregate. So let me give you an example of that in our world. I'm a marketer, and I've shipped a message to customers through sales, and I want to know what are the top objections that customers are making on slide 6. Well, if you've got Adobe again, and you have 27,000 people doing this, you don't need every single conversation ever in order to come up with the top objections. You get to critical mass at some much smaller number. And so there's an example where when you're looking for directional accuracy, sufficient directional accuracy, you can definitely sample down.
Yeah.
Also, if you're doing, for example, certain kinds of search ranking, you can look at subsets of data, because it turns out that the popularity of an item over 3 weeks versus 3 months isn't that different necessarily. And so you can just take a representative sample. But then there's other cases where, for example, the marketing team wants to know, how much money did I make the company with this content? That's called ROMI, return on marketing investment. And they would not be okay if you said, I threw away 90% of the data and I told you how much money you made in 10% of the calls. They're like, no. I get hired or fired based on this number, and it better be every damn one, and there's no option to sample. And so it really depends on the nature of the insight and the purpose of the resulting output. Is it meant to be comprehensive, and does it need to be comprehensive, or can it be a sample?
Do you have any customers in the regulatory domain where you need to, for example, prove that nothing bad was said, and that your sales reps did not say something false to a customer? Does that happen?
The challenge there is that so we don't currently support that scenario. It's an interesting scenario. The problem is that you have to require that to do that comprehensively, you have to require that all communications go through approved mediums, and so in the FinServ world, they do that. You get fined if you use your personal phone for texting or so on and so forth. But we in general don't target we check everything and give you the exhaustive answer kind of problem, because you can't miss anything. Yeah. And if it's a compliance thing, you're liable if you miss anything. And so we don't pursue those scenarios. Those are very, very tricky scenarios to get right, and we do not pursue them currently.
So let me circle back to the layering of offers and how you think about pricing. You talked earlier about how you get advantage versus competition. You've talked about making sure that you don't um, screw the pooch, as it were, relative to your margin, on sucking too much cost into your core products. I think you said when we talked a couple months ago that you have two or three different layers of AI added value separately priced
Yeah.
buckets on top. Can you talk a bit about how you're doing that?
Yeah. So one of the many of you probably have know a lot about this, but if you haven't investigated it, pricing and SKU just kind of architecture is a whole world, and there are people who have incredibly deep expertise in it, and it's quite a complicated space. And the trick is, there's a there's a great old phrase. It's an old French phrase that the art of taxation is separating the goose from as many feathers as possible with a minimum of hissing. And so it's a little bit like that, right? Where you're basically trying to price in such a way that it's understandable to your customer and it feels intuitive to your customer, and you're maximizing the amount you get and you're minimizing the amount of dissat that you're incurring, and you don't want it to feel arbitrary or unfair. So you want to somehow connect the price to the value in some as tangible way as you can. And so the way that we've done it, and this is an evolving space for us, so I won't say that we've got it all beautifully taped, but the way we've approached it is we have a set of SKUs. We have a add-on SKU that adds additional AI capabilities to our kind of lower end SKUs. And then what we've recently decided to do is what we call our hero offer, where you buy the whole product and the whole platform. We're actually putting the AI capabilities in there, included. And we're doing that for two reasons. One is we want to make it seem like a really good deal to buy the bundle. We want to sort of minimize the number of decisions you have to make if you decide to buy the bundle. We want that to be as easy a decision as possible. And the other reason is that our most advanced capabilities, which is coaching, relies very, very heavily on AI. You really can't do a good job of coaching without leveraging AI. And so we decided that we would include it in the larger bundle, but we would price it separately in the lower end tiers. And basically the argument is that we incur significant COGS in order to deliver it, and therefore we have to charge extra to cover the COGS. And so, we'll see how well that works, but that's our current strategy.
And talk a little bit about when you say we'll see how that works. There's a little bit of a need for, if you will, smart architecture like you just described, but also discovery, right?
Yes.
And so how will you actually figure that out? Is it, what is the process? You as an executive of a company that's got $200 million run rate, and you're looking to go public not too long if you've got that kind of money or coming in. So you want to make sure that you're driving your growth targets, and that these significant engineering investments with sometimes a lot of COGS are really going to ring the cash register for you
Yep.
ultimately on your income statement. So how do you think about trialing and testing things and measuring success, and then deciding, hey, when do I need to reevaluate and potentially change a decision I made 3 or 6 months ago?
Yeah. So, one of the things I've learned in this space is you think really, really hard, but IQ won't save you. At the end of the day, you got to go to market and see. And so we think really, really, really hard, and we come up with our whole strategy for our SKU model and pricing. And then you just have to go out into the world and just try it. And you all have to be very aware of the fact that it's a very different experience trying it with your existing customers versus trying it with new customers. Because your existing customers are baselined around a certain model, a certain price, a certain way of thinking about it. And it's really hard to move them into a new way of thinking. Whereas a new customer tends to be more, it's more of a de novo conversation. Although you have to be careful because, of course, your competitors are having conversations with them, obviously. And the other thing is that people move around. And so often we're talking to people who bought HighSpot before, and so they are baseline. So it's not quite as blank, tabula rasa as you'd kind of like it to be, but nevertheless, it's a different way than if you've got a customer that's already written a check and they're ready to renew. They're going to expect things to look kind of like they did before. And when you're like, hey, we have a new cool idea, which is you can pay us a lot of extra money for all these extra line items, they're like, well, I don't really like your new idea. I kind of like the old idea. And so you have to be thoughtful about the dynamic of pre-existing versus new. So you can test a little more freely with new customers. But what you have to also realize is that every customer, at least at scale, is under ferocious constraints around pricing, right? In general, you either you have to, where's the money coming from, right? Like the budget is the budget. It's not like they come in and say, oh, I'm going to add budget for this HighSpot thing. It's not like that. They're like, my budget is X, and now where am I taking it away from to give it to you? And so you have to think about how are you going to justify your share of wallet, and how are you going to argue that they should come up with more money, typically at the expense of some other bucket that they already have to pay you.
Well, but that's if you're entirely perceived as being on the cost side of the equation for that customer. And I guess the obvious question is, you're in the sales enablement business. Can you show them, hey, you can demonstrably generate more revenue by using this top level, more expensive SKU from me? And I can show you that you to roll this out and the revenue for these reps is going to go up by 20%. Therefore, I'm a small piece of that.
Sometimes, but in practice, usually there's a budget. And you can make we do make that case, of course.
I bet.
People smile and nod and say great, and then they say here's my budget. And because at the end of the day, the CFO doesn't give them a software budget that is based on a projected growth of revenue. They give them a budget, and they say your budget is X dollars for software, and talk to the wall if you don't like it. And it's very hard to get the business leaders to go to the finance team and make the case to expand the budget. That's very hard, especially in the current challenging macro climate. So in general, you mostly have to live within the scope of what is available, and you have to make the case that they should spend it on you instead of someone else. And so that's a really important part of pricing that you have to keep in mind. It's not all about you. It's a lot about their budget. And so then I never quite answered the second part of the question, though, back in a little while ago, which is, okay, it's all very well for HighSpot to talk about how to sustainably, add on AI. But what if you're a startup? How do you deal with it then? And I think it's hard to come up with like a universal answer, but here are some ways I would think about it. One is I would try to project, for sure, project your margin. For sure, model your margin. Never, 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 never don't model your margin. Now, keep in mind that your model might be wrong, but for God's sake, model it, and then revisit your model to see whether it's right or not. And the things you have to project are revenue, cost, and usage, right? Because in our case, we're charging you X dollars a month to give you AI capability, whether you use it or not. And we have to estimate how many people are going to use it. And some of them are going to use it really heavily, and some of them are going to use it lightly. So make sure you identify all the key assumptions about revenue, about cost, and cost as a factor of usage. And then as you get in market, as people buy your product, as you start being able to watch behavior, revisit your model and make sure that you are right. That's the only, and also be ready for the cost side of it to potentially get changed quite a bit by new infrastructure being, released. But modeling, basically estimating and modeling are the only path here pretty much. And then measuring against your assumptions to see how you're holding up. We are hardcore about our COGS modeling. Every single release, we have 6-week releases. Every single release, we evaluate every piece of infrastructure against our cost assumptions. We're red, yellow, green. We look for places where we're not on track to hit our numbers. And so it's very, very important to stay on top of your COGS hard. And in AI, that's heavily, heavily influenced by usage patterns, and also the degree to which you can pre-compute things So for example, if you're doing embeddings, can you compute them once and then reuse them constantly? And then it's and then you have to make some important decisions, like do I pre-compute them or do I compute them on first usage? Pre-computing is very expensive, be often because you're basically pre-computing every possible thing that could ever happen. That'll save a lot of time. It'll improve latency. So you often have to trade off latency and cost
The cost. Yeah.
because of pre-computing. We lean in pretty hard to pre-computing, but it can be very, very costly. So make sure you model that carefully and make sure you're not doing a lot of throwaway computation on things that nobody ever cares about.
We've got a few more minutes left, and we just posted a 30-second survey. I'd really encourage everybody to please take a minute to click on that and type in a couple of answers while we have this next conversation. Because Oliver, here I'm going to go off script a little bit because something happened yesterday that you probably noticed, which was GPT-5 was finally announced.
Mm-hmm.
And you also gave the example of innovating in a world where the platform advances at unpredictably, sometimes very fast rates.
Yep.
And here now, long awaited, OpenAI has put forward what does the next generation look like, and they've made some look like AI written lofty claims about what it's going to do in terms of saving humanity. But there's also a lot of innovation clearly is going to be coming forward over the next few months there. And we also know it's an arms race. So everybody else has got their set of new things that they've probably waiting to roll out as well. So can you talk a little bit about how you think about the future and how you're going to look at next generations of capability that are exposed in the core foundation models and how you will then bring them into your product planning process and ultimately deploy them?
Yeah, so I think about new releases in two ways. One is how does it make what we already do better? And so then I think about what will it take to deploy it? What cost implications does it have, pro or con? How do we start testing? Like, let's run our offline quality tests against the new offering and the old offering to see what the delta in performance is. So there's a whole raft of things to do around our existing infrastructure, our existing world. And then the other way I think about it is what's new that I can now take advantage of to do things that either I never thought of before or that I may have thought about in one way in a new way. And so I think that's the key thing is to kind of keep a list of, always have a list, and we have a very long list of challenges our customers face or things our customers care about that feel like AI could help. Even if you can't quite figure out how to do it yet, keep that list and then go back to that list when new technology comes out and then say, that thing we sort of said, that would be amazing, but not there yet. Is it now closer or here? And so that list is a really key one. Then also think about all the things you're doing and ask yourself, is there a new, different way to do them? And then also ask yourself, is this just an upgrade so I can basically just plug it into my existing solution and just get better answers? And so those are kind of three angles I would take on it.
And what are your plans from what you read about GPT-5? Any initial reactions to how that's going to help you on any of those lists you just described?
Yeah, the one area that I feel like we're not, the technology we have in our hands is still not where it needs to be, is coaching. Everything else that we're doing, it's at least decent. Of course, it could be at better, but it at least feels like we're already able to deliver a ton of value. In coaching, there's some really hard problems that the technology that's out there isn't quite up to the task, or at least no one's figured out how to do it yet. Maybe there's brilliant insights that haven't been figured out yet, but at any rate, no one's figured them out yet. And so that's where I naturally focus the hardest is what can we do to improve? And I've got ideas milling in my head, but nothing concrete yet.
Right. All right, we are at time, and I want to first of all ask everybody to click on the 30-second survey, give us some feedback, what else you want to see coming forward. We're in AMA season between now and the end of the year, so I'd like to do some more of these. We have a few of them planned, but we got more we can do. And then Oliver, I want to thank you so much for these insights. And you've got a group of people here who are trying to chart their future in products that are not yet born, and some that are born and ready to be made better by AI. And I think your insights are just incredibly valuable. So thank you so much. Really
Good
appreciate
luck to everybody. It's an exciting time to be doing a startup. I mean, it's always exciting, but it's extra exciting right now. So I wish you all the best of luck.
Sure is. Thanks again. Bye.